Now, the table is always hot with current events and social issues, but sometimes the heat can get a little intense.
Just a little
Let's
bit.
turn the temp down, take a breather, and get into this week's topic cool down. So, Andre, I wanted to ask you, what type of student were you like in school, and did it change over time?
Um, so I think we talked about this a little bit before in the education system episode. But I've always seen myself, at least back in the beginning, as a very focused perfectionist type of student. Um, it was great at the time because I'd be very into studying hard and making good grades. But as time went on, it made me develop failure anxiety that stuck with me throughout the years. If I ever made any grade lower than a B, I always felt like I wasn't trying hard enough, I wasn't studying long enough, or I wasn't smart enough, which is I think an incredibly dangerous mindset to have. So to start off, I was an incredibly anxious student. It it was no longer about how I could understand this lesson being taught to me and then it suddenly became, do whatever you have to make an A, no matter what. And like while I'm sure that my mom's intentions were to make sure that I was intelligent, when I would bring home a grade that was lower than a B, there wasn't much room for explanation as to why I made a C or D or whatever. My confidence was shaken so badly by the pressure of both my teachers and my mom that even when I knew the material, I'd sometimes find ways to cheat because I was so terrified of, not passing. Um, it wasn't until I went to college that I realized that if I failed a test, this didn't mean that I was a failure. And this was all because of one of my professors made us watch a TED talk called The Power of Believing That You Can Improve by Carol Dweck, which taught about the difference between a growth and fixed mindset. We talked about that as well on the education episode. But I would encourage everybody to even if you're not a student, to watch that TED talk because it truly changed my life for the better. I mean, the Cliff Notes version of it is like the idea is that someone with a fixed mindset is limited. They usually avoid challenges, give up easily, or believes that effort is fruitless, whereas someone with a growth mindset perseveres in the face of challenges, finds inspiration in the success of others, and believes that effort is required to build new skills. And most students in America, specifically students of color, are more likely to have a fixed mindset simply due to the challenges of being a marginalized person and the idea that we have to work twice as hard to be half as good as our white counterparts. But in college, I changed significantly as a student because I started thinking in that growth mindset instead of believing that I just couldn't learn something because I didn't get it as fast as other students did. I started to believe that I just needed, more time to fully grasp it for myself. And it's the reason why I'm such a big proponent for establishing a growth mindset in children. Instead of saying, you failed, maybe say something like, you weren't ready yet, or let's try a different method. Also, I noticed that many of the concepts that I struggled with were so much easier when the teaching method shifted or I was transferred to a different teacher altogether. I mean, I think that thinking in a growth mindset allowed me to retain more information in the long run because I wasn't just recalling information I was memorizing. I was actually truly taking the time to understand and comprehend what I was being taught. But what about you, Daquon? What kind of student were you, or did that change?
You know, this may come as a surprise to some people who knew me later in life, but early on in school, I was the laziest student out there. If I turned in a homework assignment, you thought the world was ending because I never did
Stop.
homework. I would not turn things in. Like I was the kid to just like have everything dumped in my book bag and like all types of crumpled up papers because I never really took school that seriously because I was
Hmm.
always a good test taker. So it was like doesn't really matter what I do for homework because my test scores and everything like that are going to get me a good grade. So I was like,
Yeah.
no, and I also feel like because I was such a good test taker, I felt more invisible in classes because,
Hmm.
when you have this state standard and these state tests that you have to do. The teacher is going to focus on making sure that students are brought up to that standard. And so if you're already above that standard, they're going to be like, oh, well, like you got it. I need to focus on these other students. And so it wasn't
Mm.
until, having more attention on me as a student and like teachers really being like, hey, like you're doing a great job. I really believe in you, X, Y, and Z, that I really started becoming a little bit more perfectionist and being like, you know what, let me get these A's. Let me just really shoot for it. Because before I was like, well, like I'm taking honors classes. So like even if I get a B, that's like really an A if I was in a regular class. So
Mm.
and then of course college happened, and then like I was a super perfectionist, and then I was just like, you know what, that burnt me out so quickly. C's get degrees. Let me just chill out a little bit. So that was how I was academically.
Yeah.
But socially, I think that for the most part, it's been pretty consistent. Like I'm the type of student where like if you have classes with me, like I'm pretty quiet until I warm up to you, and then I'll show my personality. And I think that, I never was like a super popular person, like anything like that. But I will say, when it came time to yearbook time, senior year, I was that bitch. Like, let me tell
Oh my
you,
God.
I won 3 superlatives. They were literally like, you cannot have all these superlatives. I
You
won
cannot.
most talented, best all around, and
Yeah.
most likely to be your boss. And so they were like, you can't have all 3. You got to choose. And I was like, you know what? Let me grace second places
Not
wherever
let
you
me
are now.
grade second
Like,
places.
there you go. Here's your go. But I think that really spoke to like how much in that second high school that I went to, I really opened up a little bit more. Like I was called on to do a lot of different things. So like even if I wasn't like taking classes at school, like I was still like very much involved and around and like doing literally everything. And so I think that really impacts how you are as a student, because like when I had that belief in me and it was very shown and I felt like I was a visible person, then I like exploded and I was doing everything. I was doing, special classes for people. I was doing tutoring. I was doing, all different types of presentations and conferences and public speaking things, even during like Black History programs and stuff like
Mhm.
that. So that's how I was as a student.
I want to ask you, do you think that you felt more pressure, like especially when you started to get that recognition and you started to get that more, get more into it like that? Do you think you felt like pressure being a Black person in school?
I would say in high school, no, it wasn't really a race thing for me in high school, because I
Mm,
feel like a good number of our peers were people of color, so it wasn't
hmm
just like that much of it. However, when I went to college, when I went to a PWI, a predominantly white institution, that all changed, because so often I felt like I needed to overperform, just
hmm
frankly because the quality of education I received was not the same quality of education so many of my white peers received. And that gets into like everything
Mm.
we talked about in the education episode of how students of color are treated in the education system and everything like that. But I really felt like I had to catch up to their level because they had more resources. They received more things throughout that K through 12 process. And so that was what made me a perfectionist, and also what made me burn out so fast.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the pressure it can be really big, a big pressure cooker, because I remember when I was, younger, I was in a lot of predominantly Black schools. The teacher, there was, if any at all, Black students from, excuse me, any at all white students that I would see within my school from up to, I think, middle school. It wasn't until like my 7th grade year that I was, actually exposed to a more diverse school system with more, people of different races coming in, and I had to deal with, seeing white people, and then, you would see in classes how they would be the ones getting called on the most, or they were the ones who got the little rewards or prizes because their grades were the highest. And so there was like a competitive nature that kind of, was breeded out of that, because you were like, well, I'm just as good as them. And I'm just as smart, or I'm just as talented. So why are they the ones getting that? Especially in theater for me, because you would notice that a lot of the shows that were being cast were mostly geared towards the white students, because the plays were oftentimes, the plays that were the cheapest to put on, because people, if you don't know this, when you put on a play in a high school, you still have to pay for the rights to showcase the play because you're making money from it. Right. So you have to pay for the rights to it. So like, there's like some of them like $150, $200, depending on, whatever. So, a lot of the stories, a lot of the shows that we would do were the cheaper ones, but those cheaper ones were the older ones. And those older ones usually had, white Caucasian male, white Caucasian female. And then, I remember one show that I had to do where I was, the only role that I was able to be cast in was as a butler. And I was like, the fuck no. Like, the fuck no. The fuck no.
Nope. Not happening.
Not at all. I was like, I'm going to clock out. I'm going to go ahead and clock out for you here. I think I'm done. So yeah, I think it really does kind of, being that student in a school that's predominantly white, or being in a school that, has those kind of pressures there. It does make it a little more difficult, and you do feel like you have to work twice as hard. And like Daquon said, there's a lot of burnout that comes from that. And sometimes you have to give yourself some grace and know, like, regardless of what these other bitches think, I'm still that one, always will be that one, motherfucking per. Okay. Right. Now, so many children grow up never knowing the full scope of what their culture has contributed to society and history. So Daquon, I think it's time for a change. Let's take a pause, rewind, and remind the world just how we did that. Lincoln University was founded in 1854 as the nation's first degree-granting historically Black college and university, or HBCU. Originally chartered as Ashman Institute, it was renamed Lincoln University in 1866 in honor of President Abraham Lincoln. During their first 100 years, Lincoln graduated approximately 20% of the Black physicians and more than 10% of Black attorneys in the nation. Their alumni have led more than 35 colleges and universities and scores of prominent churches. They also include U.S. ambassadors, mission chiefs, federal, state, and municipal judges, mayors, and city managers. Today, Lincoln graduates are also making names for themselves in creative and entertainment fields, including as writers, directors, comedians, and film executives.
Black excellence. We love to see it. Now, Barbara Charlene Jordan was an African-American lawyer, civil rights movement activist, educator, leader, and politician. She was also the first African-American elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction, and not only the first Southern African-American woman, but also the first queer woman to be elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. From a very young age, she showed she had the gift to be a great orator. This gift was seen on the national level during her famous speech during the Richard Nixon impeachment hearings. Jordan sponsored legislation that brought in the provisions of the Voting Rights Act to include Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and Asian Americans, and other legislation that would extend the minimum wage to cover non-unionized farm workers and domestic workers. In 1994, just 2 years before her death, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bill Clinton.
Black queer women.
Bringing in Women's History Month with Black queer women.
You already know. Now, as always, thank you all so much for watching, and keep the conversation going down in the comment box below. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, and if you are listening to us on our podcast, please rate and review on whatever platform you're using. You can also follow our podcast on Instagram and TikTok at the Melanin Margin for updates of new content.
And if you'd like to follow each of us, our handles are at Daquon MUE.
And at Andre Talks a Lot Honey.
Now, we will see you all next week on the Melanin Margin, where our goal is always to bring the marginalized to the spotlight in any way we can. Goodbye now.